There you go. Welcome back to the Global Indian Podcast, home to the greatest conversations and the official platform for open and liberal minds. Because yes, let's face it, we are everywhere. Now, as you know, every single week we plunge ourselves into the human experience behind our perceptions of identity, take a second look at the countries where people of Indian origin call home, and also tackle the big conversations. Well, this week in the United Kingdom is a very interesting one. Not only are we competing with the fireworks displays of Diwali, but also we've seen the UK elect its first, controversially, non-white prime minister, and probably the youngest in the last 200 years. But to help me make sense of it all, I'm joined by my fellow journalist and my dear neighbor, Vic Motune. And here we're going to be tackling the bigger questions on pace. Now, what's really fascinating about Vic is that he's one of the editors for a very famous newspaper and a media group in the UK called The Voice. They've been around for over 40 years, and it has been that pinnacle for many of the community members from Africa as well as the Caribbean to really look towards their voice within the UK and how things are shifting. So let me welcome you officially to the platform, Vic, after many weeks of lobbying. Good to finally have you here. The school run has obviously paid in my favor.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And I know we've been trying to arrange this for the longest time. So we've finally done
We
we've
finally
finally done
succeeded
it.
on the night of fireworks and
Yeah,
midterm break for the kids. So let's
absolutely.
see how we can contend with all the background noise. But Vic, why don't you quickly introduce yourself to the audience out there?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, I'm a journalist. Been a journalist for 25 years now, I think, both across print and broadcasting. The news editor of The Voice newspaper, as you mentioned. So it is the UK's largest, only national black newspaper. And, obviously my role covers highlighting a range of stories and issues and investigations with the rest of the team. There's currently, so as you mentioned, some very interesting debates going on, particularly around sort of identity and politics and entrepreneurship. So it's a really kind of fascinating time to look at how Britain's diverse communities are shaping and engaging with national conversations. And yeah, that's me. And before coming to The Voice, I was at BBC Radio. I was a radio producer for a number of years, so working across kind of broadcast media as well as supporting small and medium enterprises to try and get their message out to the media. So that was part of a little company I set up. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Is decades of experience there. So I suppose that the big part of it, Vic, is that we do sit on this really interesting time in Britain. Huge shifts and turns. How do you make sense of it? What does this mean in the ideas of Britishness at this moment in time?
Well, it's a very, very good question. I mean, certainly one of the things I sort of remember kind of growing up, in the 70s and 80s was that Britishness was all about this idea of the Union Jack, rule Britannia, ideas of empire, ideas of basically, cricket, sort of cricket and sort of fair play and all the rest of it. Um, and one of the things that is really interesting to me, certainly, in the last sort of 10 years, is the ways in which those ideas have basically been shaped and adapted by minority kind of ethnic communities. So we've seen in the last year last 2 years, just 2, 3 years, some momentous occasions. For example, the protests around Black Lives Matter, and obviously obviously George Floyd. We've seen various kind of cultural sort of movements and all the rest of it. And it's been interesting because, when I've spoken to people, friends, neighbors who are white, and one of the things they've kind of sort of hinted at is that, this kind of greater visibility, this sort of demand, if you like, for diversity and equality is somehow divisive in a way. And it's really kind of got me thinking. It's this almost this sort of idea that, you know, we're all one. And we are. How I kind of interpret it is that many of the people, and in many cases, many of the young people kind of having these debates on sort of social media, um, you know, are really coming, I think, from a perspective of absolutely being British, you know, and if obviously they reside in England, absolutely you know, being English. I think that what we've seen is a real insistence, though, on a much more inclusive Britishness, you know, a much more, you know, sort of, I guess, diverse Britishness. So it's really almost sort of saying, well, look, we're British, we're born here, and we really want equal treatment. You know, we want definitely to be part of this country. We are not, you know, second-class citizens. To give you kind of an example, I mean, I remember one of the things that was so distinct, you know, growing up was that people who were black, you know, would very rarely describe themselves as Black British or Black Britons. You know, they would say things like, you know, I'm an African in Britain, or I'm a Jamaican in Britain, even though they'd been born here. You very rarely, for example, saw sporting figures drape themselves in, you know, the Union Jack, or wave, you know, flags, or, you know, St. George's flags. And that has very much changed, I would say. I don't think you would find many, you know, black people who would come out with that, you know, phrase, I'm an African in Britain, or, you know, whatever, or Jamaican in Britain. No, very much they're black and they're British. And you see that in several kind of examples of, you know, popular culture. Just to give you one small example, grime is very definitely a cultural phenomenon that is rooted in the Black British experience and appeals to young people of all backgrounds, all diverse backgrounds. They all unite obviously around that. But I think that where you will see, you know, the campaigning, you know, where you will see that the stridentness is to say, well, look, I'm born here, you know, this is my country. Why are you stopping and searching me? Why is it that when I go into a shop, I'm profiled? You know, why is it that, for example, if I apply for a job and I have an African heritage sounding name, you know, I have to change the application form? All these sorts of questions are being asked. So I think it's really, what you're seeing is really a much more inclusive sense of what Britishness is. And you know, obviously recently the Queen, you know, has passed. And there been a lot of debates about how the monarchy can really sort of engage, you know, in that more diverse sense of what being British is. And certainly I know that, you know, King Charles, Prince Charles as he was then, but King Charles is very much about those sorts of conversations. So yeah, that's where I think we're at the present time.
What do you think is the biggest misconception then that people have of the Black British experience? Because you can see, obviously, as the paper goes, you know, the voice has been out there for over 40 years. And King Charles, Prince Charles, as he was then, actually
Hmm.
wrote, I think, one of the forwards for the book that is now taking the tour.
Hmm.
But when people look towards the community, it's almost in this mindset of saying, well, they're all generic, aren't they? It's all these people that are put together and they're on that side. And then you have the white British experience, which is here. And then the brown, it's almost like the rainbow or 50 shades of colors as a spectrum that goes. What do you think are the misconceptions that people have?
Well, it's a really good question. I mean, look, I I think what is interesting about, you know, us having this conversation is that we're having this conversation in Black History Month, you know, October. And I think, you know, where you have events, or where you have initiatives, you know, for example, that are around Black identity or are around diversity or, you know, sort of equality, I think that there's sometimes a misconception, amongst for what I'll use for want of a better term, sort of the mainstream media, that somehow, these are events that sort of over there. But I think one of the points, for example, with Black History Month, is that one of the points that's often been made is that Black history is interwoven in British history. It's definitely a part of British history, as is, South Asian, history. And I think that that perspective very often doesn't get told, So just for example, if you look at the history of some of our biggest cities, Manchester, Liverpool, London, Bristol, if you look at how those cities got their wealth, if you look at some of the street names in those cities, it's absolutely intertwined with the story of colonialism, of empire, of the transatlantic slave trade. It's integrated much more, I think, than we would ever believe. When we look at our mainstream media and we look at some of the kind of slant that gets taken, on those particular issues. I think another sort of, big misconception is around sort of this idea of sort of diversity and equality. I mean, I think that it's certainly in the last sort of 5, 10 years ago, there's certainly been a much wider conversation around it. We see that, for example, not just in the various initiatives to make the boardroom, see more diverse, but we see that, for example, when players take the knee, at the start of football matches. But there is this sort of misconception that somehow it's over there, whereas actually, diversity and equality, is very much interwoven, I would say, with the country that we are becoming. I think there was various statistics, which point to the fact that in 10 years' time, for London, for example, will have a 40 to 45% population of people, who are, Black or minority ethnic in terms of background, or would have come from somewhere else. So this perception that these issues, this history, sort of is a special case, I think is misleading and is wrong.
It's quite interesting because we've had on the platform, we've had heads of states from various different countries. And one thing that becomes apparent is when people speak about this idea of colorism, Africa is Black, the Caribbean is Black, but it's not obvious. It's a continent. We just happen to be one of a trillion species that live on this planet. So as human beings, all of a sudden we color coded an entire continent is absolutely ludicrous. On the other side, when we look at this, it also feels sometimes a bit like virtue signaling, because I think we both know as fraternity in the media, that a lot of big businesses will jump on the back of this because it makes great commercial sense. It's now, I am proud of our Black or ethnic or whichever community it is. Yeah, let's go celebrate them. By the way, if you buy this T-shirt, you can look good too. It's one of those type of sliding points. Looking at that side, when we're talking about diversity of Britain, obviously Rishi Sunak, Prime Minister, United Kingdom. What does that mean in your mindset for diversity of Britain? Is this virtue signaling? Is it just a great ploy to showcase, hey, look, the Queen's passed away. It's really sad. We now have King Charles. But do you know what? We are moving ahead. By the way, when you look at a prime minister, somebody that represents the BAME community, even that word I have an issue with. But you know what I mean. Vic, what are your thoughts on that? What's your thoughts of the Sunak-effect?
Well, I mean, look, the first thing that you've got to say is it's definitely a milestone. He not only is the first, prime minister from a minority ethnic background, the first prime minister from, from the South Asian community, definitely a milestone, but also he is the leader of a party that traditionally was associated with not being very sympathetic to the issues and problems faced by minority ethnic communities. Let's not forget, this is the party of, Enoch Powell, of the sort of some of the really horrendous debates that we had in the 1960s. This is the party that, was led by Margaret Thatcher, who famously said that Britain was being quote unquote swamped. So it's a massive achievement, but also let's bring it up to speed a little bit more and bring it up to the current day and put it into context. So when Rishi Sunak graduated from, I think it was Southampton University in 2001, in 2001, at that stage, there were no Black or Asian MPs at all, as recently as 2001. So the fact that he's become prime minister in that short space of time shows you how far the party's come, and also the country's come, because I think there've been a number of there were a number of polls which were conducted the first time that he stood in the leadership election. And one of the questions was asked was, would you be comfortable with a prime minister from a minority ethnic background? And I think majority of voters said, actually, look, it doesn't matter. It was much more important to sort the economy out. So from that point of view, it's kind of leaps and bounds, in terms of where we are. What does it mean, though? I guess for diversity, as you mentioned in politics, is it a good thing? Is it kind of virtue signaling? I think one of the things that I think it's important to remember is that whether it's the Conservative Party or any other kind of organization where you see people from a Black or Asian background rise to very high ranks, I think one of the things that is forgotten is the fact that they've been able to rise to those ranks because they've assimilated the values and the ethos and the mindset of that organization. So what often happens is you'll get somebody, a Black and brown person, rise up to the top, and the expectation is that they will be able to raise some of the issues that those communities face, bring others through. There'll be better policies. There'll be greater diversity in the organization, and that's not necessarily
So
true.
are you essentially saying it's diversity of look, but it's not diversity of thought?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, look, for example, so if I can just give you a little bit of a historical example here. So one of the organizations that I covered in my years of journalism is an organization called Operation Black Vote. And basically, Operation Black Vote's whole mandate, when it set up in 1996, was to really take some of the issues that were of real concern to minority ethnic communities, the real pain points, the lack of employment, racial discrimination, over policing, take those issues and say, well, look, we can address those by addressing the democratic deficit, right? So basically getting people of color to the voting booth, making them realize the importance and the power of their vote. And basically, to cut a long story short, what this organization did is a lot of lobbying of the main three political parties, basically saying, look, you need to get more Black MPs. You need to really get more Black MPs, change the dynamics, broaden the range of issues and things you're concerned about. They were very important in working with David Cameron, back in 2010. So it was David Cameron that famously got on the phone to all the constituency organizations and said, look, you need more Black MPs. And the reason that Black and brown people are not voting for you is this. And they were very influential in that. And so what you saw in the sort of 2010s and the 2020s was a lot of Black conservatives coming through. Many of them came through the OBV shadowing scheme. So it was a scheme where they got experience, shadowing councillors and MPs and all the rest of it. Now, what I think has happened is we've had this whole sort of generation, of Black Conservative MPs come through. Um, but what's happened is that they've been very silent on some of the real pain points that affect minority communities. The real tough ones. So for example, you've got Suella Braverman, who recently stood in the leadership election, talking about what a joy it would be for her to see a plane load of refugees be shipped back to Rwanda. You've got some of the comments that Kemi Badenoch, has kind of recently made about the lack of structural institutional racism, in the UK. And my point is that the whole point of OBV was to broaden the thought, to broaden the awareness, to broaden the issues, so that there would be a politics and a policy making that would be a lot
Reflective.
more diverse.
Absolutely.
Do you
But
know
what
what I
it
mean?
turned into was just almost fodder to get more people through the door. So therefore we showcased, yeah, we are listening to the masses. You guys are represented here. Now you have a reason to vote for us.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. You know, what, what, what? Like I said, what you've got. I mean, listen, I totally get it, right? So, what some of our Black MPs will say, our Black and Asian MPs will say, is that their first job is to represent their constituents, right? That's the first thing, and nobody would disagree with that. They would say, "Well, I want to be an MP, not a Black MP." Totally
Mm.
fine. Absolutely what should happen. And I also get the fact that many of them will have come from or represent constituencies where there isn't a big minority ethnic population. There will be from very affluent conservative safe seats. That I understand also. But I mean, to give you an example, which I think kind of highlights my thinking. So if you go back a few years, you've got the Windrush scandal,
Mm.
you know. Now, the thing was, what I remember about that was Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is what I can say, I consider him to be a Tory grandee. I mean, even the name alone tells you that this guy is a Tory's Tory. He's establishment.
Yeah.
You just have to look at him. But I remember he gave an interview on LBC radio, and he basically said, "Well, look, the Windrush scandal is a disgrace. These people who've been affected by it are as British as anybody. Um, and it was a risk for him because obviously the scandal came about from policies adopted by his own party. So he was unequivocal about it, and I just sort of remember when he gave that interview, I thought to myself, but why are so many Black conservatives silent on this particular issue? I didn't really kind of understand it, because when you look at the Windrush, we look at the Windrush generation and the subsequent Windrush scandal, it goes to the heart of, well, for example, some of the key issues you talk about on Global Indian around identity, around belonging, around hope. Many of them, had been in the UK for 30, 40, 50 years. They'd raised families, they paid taxes, in many cases were grandparents or great grandparents, to then suddenly find themselves in a situation where they're told, actually, you don't belong. And actually, then to subsequently find out that the Home Office was warned about, the dangers of a policy, obviously like that. So, but the Black MPs were silent on it, you know. I, I, so I suppose going back to my original point, that you know, that's not what diversity in politics should look like. You know what I mean? And I think probably sort of what happened is, or I mean, I'm just casting out my
Hmm.
view. I think probably what happened is many of them perhaps were afraid of the party whip, or maybe they were afraid of their own careers, or whatever it was. But the point is, you didn't necessarily need to be black to realize what a monumental letdown, that was. You didn't necessarily need to be black to be, protesting about it, because certainly on a lot of the kind of demonstrations and marches that were held in support of the Windrush generation, it was really diverse. It was a really diverse range of people, that
I think
were on
people
that.
forget that, don't they? It's when, like, if you look at Sunak's family, they came over from Kenya and East Africa. You look at the two people who really paved the way for them to come in, which was Lord Dolar Popat, who came from Uganda, an
Mm,
incredible individual. And then
mm,
you had Lord Rami Ranger, our very own ambassador for the global India, came from India, but there's a lot within Africa and the Caribbean. They understood what the issues were. And then you look at the Windrush community and it was mixed. People tend
mm,
to forget that. It
mm,
was because the British essentially said, well, you're black, okay, well, you're going over there for this. And you had
mm.
indentureship that went in, the Indians and the Chinese that went in for the tin.
Yeah.
And so there's a whole communities of people that were brought together in one way by the
Mm,
British, but they were also forcibly put to those locations, which people forget. And same
mm,
thing happened in Africa. We had the likes of Idi Amin, Uganda. Yes, the Asian community were kicked out, but likewise, there was a lot of indigenous Ugandans who suffered immense amounts of
mm,
issues. And then they
mm,
also escaped and they came to UK. So those marches should never have been color coded as such. It was about
mm,
all of us as our defined history as humans
mm.
who
Yeah.
happened, unfortunately, to go through not Britain of present day moment, but the Britain that represented 60 years ago, or 50 years ago, 40 years ago. There's obviously that transition there.
Mm,
Like when you look at the current situation, it seems to me that it's more of, okay, great. You've got somebody that's come in, he's ethnic minority that's finally broken through the ranks, but
mm,
in order to get there, a seat on the table, you have to hold a certain vision. Does that vision really indicate liberalism? Does it really talk about multiculturalism? Not just in skin color, but also in the diversity of views in which how to make an economy work and how do you
mm,
bring together all these different facets to truly say we are global Britain. It
mm.
seems to me, if I read between the lines, Rick, you're in a very kind of way manner saying, well, if you have to be a certain personality to make it in politics, how can you expect that personality then to drive multiculturalism in a country?
Yeah, I mean, look, the thing with that is that, as I think, as I was, you know, I said sort of, very briefly at the start of that,
Yeah,
is the is the it's a challenge,
yeah,
for people of color, you know, in any organization who want to make change. So I think there was some study. I can't remember. Please forgive me. But I know there was a study a couple of years back which showed that you know um, black and brown people who get to certain positions in organizations, and then they try and advocate for change, for greater diversity, are, I think, often sort of penalized, sometimes subtly, whether that's through, see, lack of promotion or not being seen committed to uh, you know, the, the cause, or whatever. But it doesn't. It's not an easy thing to do, and very often, what you find with those individuals is that it can be a very lonely path, so to
absolutely.
speak.
Well, I was going to say though, Vic, we're saying that Rishi Sunak won, but is it the case that everybody else lost? Because the person he was competing against pulled out the
Me,
race. Boris Johnson
yeah,
was going to compete, then he also said, well, this doesn't make sense.
yeah,
And if he didn't win, what would it have meant for the Conservatives? Because first time round, and if we deal with the elephant in the room, first time round, it's beyond the arbitrary factor skin color, but it's a group of white folk, and then you have one
mm,
one Asian guy saying, I'm going to compete too. If he
mm,
had lost against a white person, a male, that would have caused a bit of suspicion, I would dare say, right? Everyone
mm,
can say, great, we're voting along the lines of who's the best fit. But if we go
mm,
by this channel of idea of where the Conservatives once were, it's not too hard to utilize that evidence to say what the outcome would have been. Here, Liz Truss comes in, who had no confidence really in the party, but it is a woman, it is a female voice, and it reminds people of Thatcherism and all of that. It's a safer option to bring her in, isn't it?
Yeah.
And now all of a sudden, if Rishi Sunak didn't come on this side and he lost to somebody else, what would that have indicated to the world? And so, as much as part of me is like, great, fantastic, wonderful, I have some very dear friends of mine who are very close to the new PM. As much as I want to celebrate, on the other side, you can't help but feel slightly anxious, you know?
Yeah. I totally get where you're going with that. I really do. And it's funny enough, actually, before I came on this call, somebody was asking me the very same thing. Well, he stood, first of all, back in July, and now he's didn't win, and now he's kind of come back. And, is it somehow a desperation vote or whatever? I don't know. But one of the things that I did think, and this is just, see, my opinion. So
the legalities, you're not speaking on behalf of the voice, you're
no,
speaking on behalf of yourself.
Yeah,
That is confirmed, Rick.
Yeah. Absolutely. But, so we got into a conversation about Obama, the first time Obama got elected. And, my friend was asking me, well, do you see it in those terms? Because, that was kind of equally historic.
Absolutely.
When you kind of think about it, what I had to think about it for a minute, because it's great that Sunak is where he's at. It's not been met with the same level of fanfare than when Obama was elected president. And you can understand
there's
the
also a
fact that
cultural element. You got the Americans that will at a letter opening ceremony, then you have the British that will still be
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, there's huge history behind it. But listen, the fact that Sunak's there, not insignificant. But I guess for me, just kind of responding to your point, it's like, well, is it a real kind of celebratory moment? I think it would have been more of a celebratory moment had it gone to the country, right? Had it gone to a general election, and we could start, in the process of a general election, have those conversations, pretty much all the things that we've kind of been talking about, because that's really, so to speak, where politically, where the rubber hits the road,
court of public opinion, isn't it?
Yeah. And you get to see, well, who would back, see Rishi Sunak and why. We haven't really kind of had that, basically, the Conservative Party leader and PM is elected, obviously, it's a two, by the party and by the membership, not necessarily by the country, you know what I mean? And I think it would have been really good to kind of, and obviously, and I think this may yet happen, actually, if we do go to obviously a general election, that obviously may happen.
It's a perfect ploy, though, isn't it? I know that we're not being pessimists, but the country takes a tank for absolutely variety of different reasons, but the country takes a tank, is there. Now, all of a sudden, the greatest way to save face is saying, well, look, we are champions, at least for the minority groups. This is diversity of Britain. Look, this is what we've done as the Conservative Party. Yeah, but what about the pound falling? No, we have an ethnic minority PM. But hang on, what about all this homelessness? No, we have an ethnic minority PM. But hang on, what about this? It doesn't matter anymore, because we are now saying we are multicultural Britain. And so now it's almost let them eat cake syndrome, whereas everybody's suffering. We have that. But that, I know, it's very easy for us to say. That doesn't take away from the fact that Rishi worked damn hard to get to where he is. And the fact that you have people like Lord Dolar Popat who worked tirelessly hard. And I think that's also a thing. It's a shame, because these are the unsung heroes. People like Lord Popat, Lord Rami Ranger, because they worked hard behind the scenes to say, look,
Yeah.
this is what diversity is. I get
Mm,
what you mean, Vic. If it goes to a general election, and it will do, and
mm,
Rishi's the flag holder for the Conservative Party,
mm,
that will really showcase what modern day Britain is. Because then, if he is
mm,
voted back in, based upon
mm,
the performance over the next year, 2 years or so, then we
mm.
know that this has come to grips and it really is a grassroots led movement that people
Yeah.
see beyond the object factor skin color and they look at us
Yeah.
as saying, hey, this is
Yeah.
modern day Britain.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, let's not forget, um, absolutely everything you said. Let's not forget, as Rishi Sunak himself has conceded, that the party faces an existential, I can never get that word right,
Exponential,
existential,
yeah,
existential
exponential.
threat. It's facing a tough time. 100% it's facing a tough time.
Yeah,
So it could be that he becomes, the first PM to become, the first person of color to become prime minister. And as we've seen with Liz Truss and as we've seen with Kwasi Kwarteng, it may not last very long. But and there's a sort of a temptation to say, well, actually, Britons won't vote for a person of color. I don't think it's necessarily that. I just think that there's a lot of anger, at the Conservative Party at the moment. And I think, I mean, not just the fact that people are just very angry at the kind of the mess that we've seen in, the current political scenario. It really is messy. But I think as well that, you know, there was support for Liz Truss, but there was a support for this kind of neoliberal economics that really, I think, penalized people who really facing quite a
yeah.
tough time, and who in many cases came out of the pandemic, got the worst end of the deal, who were struggling anyway, and all for all sorts of reasons in terms of low pay, the whole thing about zero contract hours and 0 hours contract, sorry, and see low pay, lack of ethnicity pay gap reporting. They're basically a lot of people in a kind of a tough spot. And then there is this kind of support for this economic approach that potentially actually makes their lives a lot worse. So I think that if it does go to the country and he doesn't get in, it's not necessary that I think Britons won't vote for a person of color. I just think that, really what you want is somebody that can, produce an economic policy, a set of policies that unite, people
And
and bring people
unfortunately,
together.
God help us all, because common sense seems to be something that's not very common in the British political parties right now. You wish it
Yeah.
would be as contagious as COVID, but it isn't. Yeah, and
Yes.
that's what the issues are. Because when you have a
Yeah.
look at Lib Dems, it's sad to see where it's going. It feels almost like a multi-level marketing scheme. Vote for me, vote for
Mm,
me. I'm at the top. I
yeah,
don't really have to
yeah.
deliver, but I can be party leader. And the same thing with
Mm,
Labour. And now we
mm,
are where we are. Quick question then, Vic, on your side. Obviously, I was having a look at the Voice's Instagram page,
mm,
and you had it up on there. Rishi Sunak, first ethnic minority PM of Britain. And underneath that, you have all these remarks saying, well, what's he going to do for people who are black? What's he going to do for this? What's he going to do for that? And it seems that the feeling is, well, if you're not part of our community, well, why are you going to give a shit? In other words,
mm.
what does it mean for diversity? Do you think that his African background means anything to anybody? Or do people just see him as, well, he's South Asian?
I mean, I think the sad thing is, when you really try and get behind some of those comments, on Instagram, is what you're really talking about are people, a community that have for a very, very long time been disengaged from mainstream politics and repeatedly let down,
Mm.
by mainstream politics. Um, as I was mentioning earlier, it it hasn't the fact that you've had this kind of rise of generation, this rise in the generation of Black conservatives. I think when it sort of started to happen around sort of 2015, 2016, when see more of them were coming in. I think Kwasi Kwarteng was elected earlier in sort of 2010. But I think when it sort of started to happen, it was actually a genuine cause of debate, curiosity, interest, what's going to happen, how's it going to go. But I think that, you know, what you have are basically people who, in many senses, been disengaged and let down. I think that sort of reflects in the country, kind of as a whole, necessarily. So there's an apathy there,
Yeah,
and I think that these issues were very much what Operation Black Vote was actually trying to change. So that this idea that
yeah,
you use your vote, that it can actually make a difference, that politicians have to kind of compete, see,
yeah,
for your vote. Now, to sort of, you know, put that apathy again into a little bit of context. So one of the things I've actually kind of long thought is the ability to make disengaged voters excited about the issues, to really kind of engage people, in some ways is limited by the two-party system that we have, or the
yeah,
three-party system that we have, because, if you look right across the kind of political spectrum, there are no real, what's the word I'm looking for? There are no kind of individual, or what it feels like, genuine voices. For example, I can't see anybody who is an equivalent of your Bernie Sanders, that just, really electrifies people, who is not almost standing behind the party line, so to speak.
so
That
so
is,
you so Jeremy Corbyn, or not really?
no, I was going to say
Yeah,
Jeremy Corbyn.
I
That
was
was
thinking,
that
I
was
was
it.
watching your measured approach there, Vic, and I
Yeah,
realized that there
because
was
because I would say that I'm talking about currently,
yeah, I know what you
who's
mean.
kind of on the
Somebody
scene.
that's authentically going to say these are the
Yeah,
genuine issues. This is what we
yeah,
need to do. And the thing is,
yeah.
we had hoped that Rishi, he doesn't need to call any favors because he's got enough money in the bank. So
Mm,
it's not that
mm,
he has to have any
yeah,
lobbyists out there. But
yeah,
you're
yeah,
absolutely right. Somebody that will speak for the little man and the
yeah,
big man,
yeah.
but will act without fear or favor to do what's best for Britain, but also being cognizant that to make Britain where it is, it's about
Mm,
reaching out to the
yeah,
communities because those are
yeah.
ultimately your custodians. That's what creates your
Mm,
economic diplomacy with different nations, public
yeah,
diplomacy. India's been working very hard at that.
yeah,
Likewise, other nations. No, I get what you mean. I get what you
yeah.
mean.
Absolutely. And the other thing to kind of bear in mind as well. So, that sort of man of the people figure that Corbyn was. So any politician in that vein is always going to get a hard time from the right leaning.
Yeah.
I call them the right leaning kind of British tabloid press. But definitely there is a definite agenda you need to conform to. Um, it's interesting that you know sort of Tony Blair, before, in the years before he became prime minister, himself, Alistair Campbell, um, they spent a long time courting, papers like The Sun and the Mail, because they recognized
The
that's
sheer
what they
power.
kind of needed to do.
Yeah.
So it's almost like you've kind of got to be not just, to engage disengaged voters and people who switched off from
You have to
politics.
be well rounded, but you have to understand the mechanisms in which people now make selective decisions on
Yeah,
media friendly. Do you have the face? Do you have the voice? Do you
yeah,
have the ability to connect with people and have that empathy that is translated through the different modes of contact?
yeah, yeah, absolutely. So going back to, your question about what you'll have seen on, see the Voices Instagram pages, I think it reflects, unfortunately, that apathy, and it reflects, I think, you know, a sort of an apathy, which is, you know,
I know what you mean. You're saying
yeah,
it's not directed towards Rishi Sunak, it's just
yeah,
directed towards politics in general.
yeah,
It's saying,
yeah,
well, we've seen this before, we've smelt the
mm,
t-shirt, we know what's happening here. What's really going to change?
yeah.
Vic, it's as always, it is great to speak to you. And I just want to say
Likewise.
massive thank you for coming on because I'm
Yeah.
looking at the time, I'm realizing as both fathers that we are, we got kids that are gonna be screaming anytime soon. But hopefully
Yeah.
this is gonna be the first of many more that you're gonna
Mm,
jump on board with. And if people want to find out more about your work, obviously you're the news editor for The Voice, so they can always see your handiwork there. And you've also been in TV, you've been in radio. Vic, I dare say, I don't understand why you're not in politics. You're the well-rounded individual, aren't you?
I've been asked that question before, believe it or not.
Good. Vic, it's lovely to have you on, my man.
Likewise. Thank you so much, Roger, for having me on the show.
You're welcome.